Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a really tough question. Africa's got incredible resources, immense human potential, yet extreme poverty is still such a persistent reality for so many.
It really is.
Just think about this statistic. In 2022, something like 38% of people in Sub-Saharan Africa lived on less than $2.15 allowance a day. Shocking.
It's a stark figure.
So we've been digging through a lot of material, trying to get to the heart of why.
Yeah.
What are the key drivers?
And it's definitely not just one thing, is it?
No, it's this complex web. You've got history, politics, economics, social factors, even the environment all playing a role.
Right, a whole mesh of interconnected issues.
And we should also say, it's not the same story everywhere across the continent. There are big regional differences we need to keep in mind.
Absolutely. That nuance is crucial. But maybe we should start with the history, because you really can't understand the present without looking back.
Agreed. That long shadow, particularly from colonialism and the slave trade.
Exactly. These weren't just historical events. They fundamentally reshaped Africa's economic trajectory, still felt today.
Okay, let's start with colonialism then.
Yeah.
It wasn't just flags and borders changing. It was a deep economic restructuring.
Oh, profoundly. European powers came in and, well, systematically extracted mineral wealth, gold, diamonds, copper, you name it.
And the profits mostly flowed out.
Overwhelmingly. Local communities saw very little benefit, but maybe even more disruptive was how they forced a shift in agriculture.
Towards cash crops.
Yes, things like coffee, cocoa, cotton, all destined for European markets. This wasn't about feeding local populations.
And that crippled local food production.
It often did. We have these tragic cases, like in Tanganyika, where focusing so heavily on cash crops led to actual famines because land and labor were diverted away from growing food. It fundamentally undermined food security and diversified economies.
So they didn't just take resources, they fundamentally altered how people sustained themselves. And the trade setup itself, unequal from the start.
Completely. Africa became the source of cheap raw materials and then had to buy back expensive manufactured goods.
Which basically stopped local industries from ever getting off the ground.
Precisely. It created this dependency. And think about the infrastructure. They did build the railways, the ports.
Built for extraction, right.
Exactly. Designed to get resources out efficiently, not to connect African economies internally. So after independence, you were left with these fragmented markets.
Plus, I understand African entrepreneurs were actively discouraged.
Oh, yes. Restrictions were put in place to prevent competition with European businesses. It all cemented an economic structure based on dependency, a structure that's been incredibly hard to shake off.
And then, layered onto that, or perhaps preceding and enabling parts of it, is the sheer devastation of the various slave trades.
Yes. The transatlantic, but also the trans-Saharan, Red Sea, Indian Ocean trades. The loss of human capital is just staggering to comprehend.
Millions of people, often in their most productive years.
Ripped from their communities. Imagine the impact on agriculture, on craftsmanship, on local economies trying to grow. It was catastrophic.
Beyond just the numbers, it created instability.
Immense instability. The violence, the raiding, the way it destabilized existing political structures, it fundamentally eroded trust. Trust within communities, trust between communities.
And that lack of trust must have hampered economic cooperation for generations.
Absolutely. How can you build complex trade networks or pool resources when trust is broken? And tragically, some existing political institutions were even warped or co-opted to facilitate the trade.
I know some economists have actually tried to measure the long-term economic impact.
Yeah, it's fascinating though, Grim. Econometric studies show a pretty strong link between how intensely a region was affected by the slave trades and its level of poverty today.
Wow.
Some analyses suggest, average income in Africa might be significantly higher if those trades hadn't happened. It also fueled ethnic fractionalization, making nation building harder later on.
A deep, deep scar. And we have to acknowledge the complex internal dynamics, too, African involvement in the trade.
It's a painful and complex part of the history, absolutely. But the combined external and internal forces fundamentally damaged the continent's development path.
Okay, so moving forward in time, let's talk about the post-independence era. Political instability and governance issues seem like recurring themes.
They are absolutely fundamental. You just can't have sustained economic growth without political stability and reasonably effective governance. It's the bedrock.
And Africa has seen waves of coups d'etat.
Far too many. And each one is incredibly disruptive. It undermines development efforts, weakens democratic institutions if they exist, and often deepens social divisions.
Military regimes often don't lead to stability either, do they?
Often the opposite. They might lack legitimacy or the skills needed for complex economic management, leading to further instability and often economic decline down the line. It just creates this constant climate of uncertainty.
Which must scare off investment.
Hugely. Both domestic investors and foreign companies become hesitant when the political situation is volatile. Who wants to invest long-term if the government could be overthrown tomorrow?
And then there's outright armed conflict. Civil wars, insurgencies, terrorism. The chaos is just immense.
Devastating. Economically, conflicts destroy infrastructure, halt farming and trade, force people to flee their homes. The direct economic losses are huge. Some studies show intense conflict can slash annual growth by like 20%.
20%, that's massive.
It's crippling. And then think about the indirect cost resources diverted from health and education to military spending.
And conflicts rarely stay contained, do they?
No, they often spill over borders, creating instability in neighboring countries, disrupting regional trade, leading to refugee crises. It becomes this vicious cycle.
A conflict trap?
Exactly. Poverty can breed conflict, and conflict deepens poverty. It's incredibly hard to break out of.
Alongside instability, there's the persistent problem of corruption.
Yes. Corruption and weak governance. A massive, massive drain.
How does it hinder development so much?
Well, fundamentally, it means resources get misallocated. Money that should go to schools, hospitals, roads, productive investments, it gets diverted into private pockets or wasted on inefficient projects.
And it deters investment too, I imagine.
Absolutely. It's like a tax. It increases the cost of doing business, creates uncertainty about contracts and regulations. Why invest if you constantly have to pay bribes or worry the rules will change?
It just undermines everything.
It erodes the rule of law, weakens the institutions that are meant to uphold it, and destroys public trust in government. People become cynical.
And the sheer amount of money lost.
The estimates for illicit financial flows out of Africa are staggering. We're talking maybe $60 billion, some say up to $140 billion annually, money that could be transforming economies.
There's sometimes this cynical argument that corruption greases the wheels, helps things get done.
That's a dangerous myth. It doesn't grease the wheels, it sands the wheels. It makes everything slower, more expensive, and less efficient. And weak governance, well, that's the environment where corruption thrives.
So even if a country have natural resources, corruption can mean that wealth doesn't benefit the population.
Precisely. Which leads us to another major structural issue. That dependence on raw materials.
Right, the resource curse idea.
Yeah. Many African economies rely heavily on exporting just a few unprocessed commodities: oil, minerals, cocoa, coffee. Often it's like over 70% of their total exports.
And that makes them vulnerable.
Hugely vulnerable. Global commodity prices swing wildly, so you get these damaging boom and bust cycles. Remember Nigeria in 2014? Oil prices crashed, and their GDP took a massive hit.
Because the economy wasn't diversified enough to absorb the shock.
Exactly. And the big missed opportunity is value addition. Processing the raw materials at home.
Like the cocoa example.
Perfect example. Africa produces, 70% of the world's cocoa beans, but captures maybe less than 5% of the value in the global chocolate market.
All that potential for jobs, for wealth creation, just lost.
Lost because the processing, the manufacturing, the branding happens elsewhere. This ties back to the colonial model, doesn't it? That pattern of exporting raw stuff.
It really does. So it feels like being stuck selling basic ingredients instead of the finished, more valuable product. How do economies break out of that?
Well, the key has to be industrial diversification. Building up manufacturing, services, other sectors.
But that's been a challenge for Africa compared to, say, parts of Asia.
It has. The industrial sector remains relatively small in many countries. This means fewer stable jobs, less resilience when commodity prices fall, and it makes it harder to compete globally.
What are the main hurdles to industrializing?
Oh, there are quite a few. Inadequate infrastructure power, transport is a big one. Limited access to finance for businesses. Political instability, as we discussed, and external shocks like the pandemic hit manufacturing hard too.
Have there been attempts in the past?
Yes, things like import substitution industrialization were tried, but often face their own challenges, like inefficiency or lack of competitiveness.
Is there hope on the horizon? I hear a lot about the African Continental Free Trade Area.
The AfCFTA, yeah. It holds significant potential. The goal is to create a huge single market, making it easier to trade within Africa, especially in manufactured goods and services.
So encouraging regional value chains.
Exactly. Processing goods within Africa for African consumers, which could be a major driver for industrial development and diversification. It's a long-term project, but a very important one.
Okay, let's broaden the view again. External factors, international debt, and aid. How do they fit in?
They're definitely part of the picture, and it's complicated. Let's take debt first. For many African countries, the debt burden has been growing significantly.
Debt to GDP ratios are rising.
Yes, quite sharply in recent years. And often, African countries face much higher borrowing costs, higher interest rates than developed nations, sometimes over 10%.
Ouch. So servicing that debt must eat up a lot of government revenue.
A huge chunk. Money that could be spent on health, education, infrastructure is going just to pay interest. You mentioned Ghana earlier in 2023. I think it was around 26% of government revenue went just to interest payments.
That's unsustainable.
It stifles growth, it crowds out private investment because interest rates are high, and it limits what the government can spend on its people. There's a real growing risk of debt distress, even defaults, in several countries.
And who holds this debt is changing too, right? More private lenders? Countries like China?
That's another shift. Less from traditional institutions like the World Bank or Paris Club, more from private bondholders and bilateral lenders, which can make restructuring more complex if things go wrong.
Okay, and what about international aid? It's often presented as a solution.
Well, the impact of aid is, frankly, heavily debated. There's no question it plays a crucial role in humanitarian crises, famine relief, disaster response, and it can provide vital support for specific sectors, like funding vaccination programs or building schools. But there are long-standing concerns. Does it create dependency? Is it sometimes undermined by corruption or mismanagement in recipient countries? Does it always align with the country's own development priorities?
Some argue it hasn't really driven broad, sustainable growth on its own.
That's a key argument. That aid effectiveness is often limited by those underlying political and institutional factors we talked about, state weakness, governance issues.
And is aid increasing or decreasing?
Actually, there's been a trend of overall foreign aid to Africa declining recently.
Interesting. So the focus is shifting.
Increasingly, yes. There's more emphasis now on African-led solutions, on boosting trade and private investment, strengthening governance, building domestic capacity. The idea is moving towards empowering countries rather than just providing aid, though targeted aid certainly still has a role.
It really drives home that poverty isn't just about dollars and cents. The social dimensions, the human capital aspect.
Absolutely critical. Think about education. Limited access to quality education is a massive barrier. It hinders skills development, traps people in low-wage work, and perpetuates poverty across generations.
And investment in education and health is often low.
Too low in many places, leading to lower productivity. You see huge gaps in, say, school completion rates between the wealthiest and poorest kids.
And health impacts productivity too.
Directly. Poor health, chronic conditions, the devastating impact of diseases like HIV/AIDS in the past, it all reduces people's ability to work and earn.
And then there are inequalities baked into the system.
Deep-rooted inequalities. Based on where you're born, your ethnicity, your gender, women in particular often face significant disadvantages in accessing education, finance, land, good jobs. Parental background plays a huge role. All these factors limit opportunities and keep people stuck, often in the informal economy with little security.
And layered on top of all this now is the growing threat of environmental change.
Yes, climate change and environmental degradation, like desertification, are increasingly becoming major drivers of poverty, especially in Africa.
How so?
Well, think about agriculture, which so many people depend on. Rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, sometimes too much, sometimes too little, more frequent droughts, extreme weather events. It's wreaking havoc on crop yields and water security.
Which directly impacts income and food availability.
Exactly. Some estimates suggest climate impacts are already costing African economies maybe 2–5% of GDP annually. And desertification, land turning to desert, shrinks the available farmland.
Can it fuel conflict too?
It can, unfortunately. When resources like water and fertile land become scarcer, it can definitely exacerbate tensions between communities or groups.
And the terrible irony is that Africa contributes so little to global greenhouse gas emissions.
Tragically ironic. The continent is on the front lines, suffering disproportionately from a problem it did very little to create. Erratic weather, drought. It means less food, more hunger, deeper poverty.
It's just sobering. Seeing how all these threads, history, politics, economics, social issues, the environment are so tightly interwoven.
They really are. You can't pull on one thread without affecting the others.
And as we said at the start, this plays out differently across the continent. The picture isn't uniform.
Not at all. If you look at data from the World Bank or IMF, you see huge variations in GDP per capita, in human development indicators, poverty rates from country to country, region to region.
Even overall growth figures can be misleading.
Definitely. The headline growth projection for Sub-Saharan Africa might be, say, 3.3% for 2024, but that hides massive differences. Resource-rich countries might grow slower if prices are down. Conflict-affected countries obviously struggle immensely.
And access to basic services varies wildly, too.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
Think about electricity. Something like 220 million people just in West and Central Africa lack access. Access to clean water, sanitation, healthcare, school enrollment. Big disparities depending on where you live.
So progress in reducing these regional inequalities has been slow.
It seems to have slowed in recent years, yes.
Yeah.
Tackling these geographic disparities is another huge challenge.
Okay, so bringing this all together, tackling poverty in Africa, it's clearly not about finding one magic bullet.
Absolutely not. It demands a really holistic, integrated approach. You need progress on multiple fronts simultaneously.
Good governance, fighting corruption.
Critically important. Strengthening institutions, making them accountable, investing seriously in people, health, education skills.
Diversifying economies away from just raw materials.
Essential. Managing debt responsibly, pushing for fairer international trade and cooperation, actively tackling those deep social inequalities we talked about.
And building resilience to climate change.
Absolutely. That has to be central now. It's about addressing the historical legacies while building robust systems for the future.